In this video, we're going to talk about different types of printmaking. So in order to make a print, you need to start with a matrix, which is basically the surface that creates the image. So it could be stone, wood, or metal, and you're going to alter it either chemically or by physically carving out pieces of it, and then you will ink the surface and be able to make multiples from that image. And there needs to be a certain amount of pressure to do this, so when you push the plate into the paper, you're going to create an impression of where the plate was. And that's called a plate mark. While there's always going to be a little bit of variation in each print because it is hand printed and not mechanically done, when they all look primarily the same and it's a numbered set of prints, this is called an addition. And at the bottom of each print in an addition, the artist is going to write the title, the number. So for instance, if it was the fourth print out of 50, you would put 4/50, and then the artist is going to sign it. So before you can create an actual edition, you're going to need to proof these prints, because sometimes you think it's done, but then you print it and it doesn't look exactly how you want. That print that was incomplete or unsatisfactory is a progress print. There's also prints called artist proofs, and these also exist outside of an edition or the identical numbered set. The artist proofs are basically their personal copies for whatever they want to use. If they want to keep it themselves or maybe like lend it out to shows. And usually this is indicated by AP for artist proof, where you would normally see a number for the edition. So at the bottom of an artist proof, you're going to see the title, AP, and then the artist's signature. The first type of printmaking that we're going to talk about is relief. So relief printing is where the raised pieces of the matrix, which is either a plate or a block, are inked to create the image. So for instance, relief prints in daily life like fingerprints or rubber stamps. You put the surface into an ink and then the raised pieces are going to receive the ink, whereas the recesses will not. So the white lines that you see in your fingerprint when it's printed are just the recessed grooves in the actual print of your finger. So they didn't pick up any ink because they're grooves in your finger, which is the same thing with relief printing. The top surfaces are going to receive that ink so they can be reproduced. So in order to create a relief block, the artist is going to remove the whites of the image, usually by carving them away with tools like gouges, knives, or chisels. So the artist is literally removing those pieces from the block and creating those recesses so that when they roll the ink onto the surface, it doesn't go into those places, which creates the quote whites of the image. In order to roll the ink onto a relief block, you want to use one of these tools pictured here in this bottom image. The bottom two are called brayers, and the larger tool is called a roller. So when the artist goes to print, they're going to take one of these tools, roll it into a flat bed of ink, and then roll it onto the print. And if they need more ink or they didn't get enough, they just go back to their bed of ink, roll some more onto the roller or the brayer, and then roll it back onto the relief block to put more ink on there. The oldest, most traditional method of relief printing is called a woodcut, where the artist is literally carving into wood, and then this altered wood block becomes the matrix that will create the print. As we see in this top image, woodcuts often rely on high contrast and bold black markings. It's also very evident which way the artist was carving, because you can see the strokes where they were pulling out the pieces of wood. Even in areas that are meant to be totally white, like we see in this top image, you can still see the pattern of where they were carving out that white, and it still picked up ink in the tops of those little valleys of carvings. Now, woodcuts really flourished in Japan, in what is present-day Tokyo, in the 17th and 19th centuries. Oftentimes, these woodcuts depicted famous actors, nightlife, landscapes, and even erotic images. Woodcuts were also preferred by the middle class because it was much cheaper than buying a painting. And while we address the top image as being really recognizable as a woodcut, the bottom image is also a woodcut, just using different layers of color. In order to do this, the artist has to separate a singular image into its colors. So for instance, there might be one plate that only prints the yellows in the image, one that only prints the blues, and then maybe one last one that only prints the blacks of the image, which could look almost like an outline or like a coloring book, because all of the color was in the previous layers. So when you're using multiple blocks, it's really important that they line up together, And this process is called registration. So you will register the colors to each other when you're printing them. So a more modern medium within relief cut is linoleum or a lino cut. Linoleum is just a rubbery synthetic surface. It's much softer than wood, so it's easier to carve. But in addition to being softer, it also doesn't have a grain. So with the wood grain, you kind of have to be really conscious of how you're carving in relation to that grain. Are you going with it, against it? And as a result, linoleum cuts can carve in any direction, which you can see in this bottom example. So looking again at prints with different layers, they don't always have to have a different block for each color. The alternative is a reduction print. So using a reduction print, you're registering your images on the same block. So you'll carve a little bit, print in one color. Carve more, print in another color. Carve more, print in another color, as many times as the artist wants to. So for example, if the artist wants to create a yellow sky with white clouds, they would carve out where the white clouds would be, ink up the sky to be yellow, and then print it. So then, if they wanted to have blue trees on top of this, they would carve out everywhere they want the yellow sky to be, ink it up in blue, and then it would print on top. So the sky would be left yellow because it would not have been inked up with the block because the artist carved it away. Registering a reduction print is much easier than a multi-plated print because when you're using a reduction print, you're just using the same block. Whereas if you're using multiple blocks or multiple plates, they're usually not going to be exactly the same size and shape, so the artist has to account for that when they're registering the images to each other. The next type of printmaking is called intaglio. In short, it is the opposite of relief. So in relief, we were inking up the top surface, and the whites were the grooves that were left without the ink. So in intaglio, you're going to push the ink into those grooves and then wipe that top surface clean. So the top surface will be your whites, and the grooves will have the ink being the darks. These grooves are made by scratching into a metal plate, cutting into it, or etching it with acid. So to reiterate, the artist is not carving away the white areas like in relief printing, but they're adding in by scratching the black areas and making lines. Traditionally, intaglio is done with polished copper plates, but now artists use things like zinc, steel, aluminum, and even some plastics. The first method of intaglio is engraving. This is where grooves are cut into the plate. This is done with a tool like a burin, which we see in this bottom image. And using a burin, it's actually going to remove a narrow strip of the metal as it's creating the groove. So it's not just pushing the material to the side, it's actually pushing it out to create the recess for the ink. Using this tool requires precision and control because shading is done primarily with cross-hatching and cross-contouring lines. There's also a level of pressure required in order to remove the material. So a small thin line where you're just staying really shallow in the plate, removing only a little bit, is going to be easier than if you're pushing deeper into it and removing a thicker line. Either way, you're carving into a substance like metal or wood, which is not going to be as soft as a material like linoleum. The next type of intaglio is called Drypoint, and these lines are not carved out like an engraving. They're scratched into the plate, usually with a steel needle. In doing this, because you're not removing that material and carving it out, it has to go somewhere. So it's going to bow out and create these little burrs like we see in this bottom image, and these are raised portions on the side of the grooves that will actually hold ink themselves. Next we have Mesotent, which is technically a dry point process as we are creating those burrs, but the technique of making the image is very different from scratching into it with a needle. In order to prepare the plate to be a Mesotent, the artist needs to use a rocker, which is what we see in this top image, and it's a chiseled toothed tool that puts scratches and dots into the surface of the plate. So the artist will basically, like the name says, rock this tool back and forth in lines in all different directions to just create a bunch of burrs all over the surface of this plate. And because burrs hold ink, technically with this surface coated in them, this would print totally black. So in order to create white and seemingly gray areas, the artist is going to burnish or smooth out by flattening these burrs so they'll hold less ink. So basically, wherever you burnish more is going to be the whitest parts of the page. Wherever there's no burnishing is going to be totally black because there's all those burrs holding ink. And the artist has a lot of control over how they shift in between those values. Another form of intaglio is called etching. And in etching, you're actually going to use acid to bite the lines into the plate. So the acid is going to eat away at the metal. So the lines are not carved, they're not scratched, they're actually burned in with the acid. The acid will eat in these little grooves. And to control how this happens, the artist will completely coat whatever metal plate they're using in a ground, which is an acid-resistant wax or varnish. Then they'll use a needle-like tool to scratch off where this varnish is and expose the metal below it. So basically you have this ground on top, you're going to scratch off your lines, and then you put it in acid. So the acid is only going to eat and make grooves where that metal is exposed. So to achieve different line weights or thicker and thinner lines, the printmaker can leave their plate in the acid bath for a longer amount of time or use a stronger acid. This process is also much easier because you're just scratching into this very soft ground material rather than engraving into the metal itself. So you usually get a lot more relaxed lines rather than those stiff and controlled engraving lines. Also, etching is a bit more forgiving. So if the artist makes a line that they don't like in the ground stage, they can just add ground in and fill in that hole so the metal is no longer exposed and then it won't be etched into the plate. Aquatin is technically a type of etching because you're still using acid to create those recesses for the ink. But where etching is more about creating black lines, Aquatin is more about creating fields of value, so different variations of grays, blacks, and whites. Similar to Mesotent, you're going to have to treat the surface of the plate before you can start working on it. So for this process, the artist will sprinkle acid-resistant powder onto all of the areas that they want a gray tone. So when the plate goes into the acid, there's not going to be these exposed lines. Instead, it's just going to eat away at those little spaces in between the powder. So less powder will expose more of the plate, making more grooves that will hold more ink, creating a darker value. On the flip side, if you add more powder, less of the plate will be exposed, so it'll eat away at smaller spaces and create a lighter value. And again, time in the acid as well as the strength of the acid will have an effect on the final image. So onto our third sect of printmaking. We started with relief, then we had intaglio, next is lithography. Lithography does not rely on altering the physical surface of the plate, so you're not cutting into the matrix at all, but instead it relies on the opposition of oil and water. So this is less about having valleys in the surface of the matrix and more about having chemical differences. Traditional lithography uses Bavarian limestone, just a very flat stone that's been ground to have a very even surface. But in recent years, there's also been metal plates that mimic the same surface. And either method is going to require the artist to draw directly onto that surface using greasy materials. Then, that surface with the greasy drawing on it is going to be chemically treated with gum arabic and acid that will fix the image to the stone. Next, the artist is going to wipe down the surface with water. So, in doing this, the water is going to be pushed away from those oily areas, and it's only going to cover the pieces of the stone that don't have the drawing on it. Then the artist is going to ink up their roller with an oil-based ink, and then roll it onto this treated surface. So in doing this, the water, which is everywhere except for where the drawing is going to leave a barrier between the inked roller and the plate. But everywhere where there's that greasy material, there's no water, so the ink is going to touch the plate in those areas. So you're only going to be inking where that drawing is and not where the water is. So some of these greasy materials are a grease crayon or a grease pencil. There's also tush, which is a greasy liquid you can brush onto the surface. Toner powder is something used recently where you take one of those metal plates, you put the toner powder where you want it, and then you're going to heat it so that it adheres to that surface. There's also photomechanical transfers where you take a printed image and you transfer it to the surface of the plate. So if you do use one of the more recent developments of the metal plate, then once you use it, you're basically done. But if you're using one of the traditional materials, the Bavarian limestone, you can actually grind off the surface and keep reusing that stone. Lithography was perfected in the early 19th century, and it had a major impact on media. It could be produced really quickly and easily, and even found itself in newspaper illustrations, posters, and handbills before more modern photographic printing processes. This image down here is created by Art Nouveau artist Alphonse Mucha, who was known for this Art Nouveau imagery that he achieved by using multiple layers of litho printmaking. One subset of litho is offset lithography, which is an indirect image transfer from a photomechanical plate to a rubber cylinder and then to the paper. This process is often used with books that have a lot of photos in them. Moving on to the printing press, all of those processes that we just talked about, relief, intaglio, litho, they all require a level of pressure that's usually best achieved using a printing press. This bottom example is called an etching press, but it can be used for relief or intaglio processes. So to use this, the artist is going to ink up their plate, put it on the bed or the flat portion of the press. They're going to put their paper on top of it, and then some sort of blanket, usually a felt, and then they're going to crank it through under this roller in the middle that's going to put a lot of pressure on it, making sure that there's a really even transfer of the whole image and all of that ink really sticks to the paper. The knobs on the top of the etching press actually allow you to lower and raise the roller to account for the height of your block. So on the litho press, which is our top example here, you can still adjust the amount of pressure, but it's not going to be constant. You have to pull down that lever on the top to get your pressure, and then you crank it through in a very similar way. Printing presses can come pretty small, like a tabletop press, but they can also be as large as a very big dining table, like in this bottom example. In either case, they're usually going to be pretty expensive. So as a result, printmakers often join collectives or community shops where they pay dues to use the equipment. And while that's just a practical solution to a fiscal problem, it's also just a part of the printmaking culture. A lot of print shops are like small communities. Now, if an artist wants to work without a press and they don't have access to a print shop, they can also hand rub relief prints by using a wooden spoon or a baron, which can be fairly time consuming depending on the size of the piece, but if it's small, it's usually pretty manageable. Another type of printmaking that does not require pressure or a press is stencils. So while there might be some overlap with painting, this is technically considered a form of printmaking because of the ability to very easily create multiples. Stencils rely on basically having a design cut out of a sheet of paper, cardboard, metal, some other flat material, and then transferring your medium and, as a result, your image through this stencil. Some famous street artists like Banksy or, as we see here, Nick Walker rely on using stencils. So for this example, there was a different stencil for every color used. Another use of a stencil is with a monotype. A monotype is a print process that cannot be repeated, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it is technically a printing process. For example, an artist could paint an image using watercolors onto a sheet of plexiglass and then transfer it onto paper using a printing press. So there's still a matrix and there's still a print, but there can never be an addition because the matrix is not fixed, it's very temporary. Monotypes can include a wide variety of materials, like I mentioned watercolor or even using printmaking ink, but also even acrylic if you move fast enough. But this process works really well with stencils. So for instance, if you have a background color and then you lay down a paper stencil and you print it, the color is going to go everywhere but where the stencil was, which conceptually is just how a stencil works. You're just using a press and ink rather than spraying paint onto a wall. So a screen print, also called silk screen or a serigraph, is technically a subset of stencils. So to create the screen, you're going to have fabric tightly stretched around a rectangular frame. The stencil will be applied, and then the artist will use a squeegee, which we can see in this top photo is a rubber-edged blade. And when the artist pulls it across the screen with ink on it, it's going to push that ink through the holes in the stencil. Emerging in about the early 20th century, screen printing is really compatible with mass production, like posters, advertisements, and clothing, because registration is really easy, printing is really quick, and it can print onto any surface that's flat. When artists set out to create their imagery, they can do this in a hand-drawn manner like we've seen in the previous examples, or with digitally edited designs like we see in this Warhol example. Warhol took this photo that already existed of Marilyn Monroe and altered it digitally to get these different color separations. He basically just printed off these different layers, created his stencil, and then pulled the different layers of this print. So there's no hand-drawn element to this image, even though it was pulled by hand. Photoscreen is another way of working with photographs, and it's a mechanical process where you just use a photographic stencil. So those were the main types of printmaking, even though each of them have additional subsets and techniques within themselves, along with other less common techniques that I didn't even have time to mention. But now we're moving on to contemporary approaches. So contemporary printmakers are going to play with the concept of reproduction and creating multiples, both referencing the history of printmaking and just utilizing the formal and conceptual properties of creating multiples of a singular image. Other printmakers are going to actually just combine media, whether they're combining different kinds of prints, like a litho and a woodcut, or if they're just going to print on top of another medium, like a sculpture or a drawing. Some artists use digital techniques to edit their imagery, or even mechanical means to put that image into the matrix. For instance, sometimes people have CNC machines cut their woodblock for them instead of having to hand carve it. And other times, people use machines to just 3D print altogether, which, though very different in nature, is still a means of creating multiples. I want to briefly introduce you to some contemporary artists that are using printmaking. This artist is both a mathematician and a printmaker. Some of her works really lean into being minimalist, and others are concerned with structures. They often deal with the theme of home, displacement, and borders. And left to right, these examples are a woodcut and an etching. Next, this artist actually creates installations with her printmaking. She's interested in place through urban planning and anthropology. This example uses linoleum cuts or lino cuts and monotypes on mylar, which she then collages with wooden frame components. Next, we have an artist who really works across different media, but she has the common theme or motif of the black silhouette. She analyzes gender, sexuality, race, violence, and the history of slavery in America. This example combines litho and screen printing. The background image that looks more like a drawing is a lithograph, and the front image with the very flat black is a screen print. We have another multimedia artist working primarily in 2D. She explores Chinese history, gender, and identity. This example is a lithograph, and it actually uses a technique we didn't cover called chine-coller, which is where you bond a thin piece of paper onto a thicker piece of paper for support, but you do this in the printing process. So both pieces go through the press, and they bind to each other in the process. This artist is actually a street artist. She pastes her prints in public and also creates print-based installations. This is an example of a woodcut installation. So she printed on paper and then installed her pieces onto a harder material, probably wood, and then stood them up. This artist creates work about his indigenous culture and identity, and this work is an example of a screen print. Another artist working in different media, she explores race, gender, heritage, and the history of African dysphoria. There's a motif of found objects in her work, and this example actually combines woodcut and litho. This artist is both a printmaker and a sculptor. Her concerns are primarily about the environment, and she studies mycology, which is the study of mushrooms. So these two examples are actually trash that she took out of the river, inked up with a roller or a brayer, and then sent through the press to create a monoprint. So for the so what, I think that printmaking is super important for a lot of reasons. First of all, it explains a lot of how we disseminate information. From band posters to social activist flyers to advertisements or works of art. Printmaking makes a singular thing available to a lot of people. There's also a sort of safety net with having an image that you can reproduce. For instance, if I spend 30 hours on a drawing, I'm not going to want to experiment with it. But if I have a print that I can just make another one, I might experiment with how I install it. What if I want to cut it up and rearrange it, or collage it with another piece? There's a lot more freedom and safety, or I guess less of a risk when working with a print, whereas a drawing, you have to spend an additional 30 hours and it's probably not going to look exactly the same anyway. Beyond the functionality and practical reasons, printmaking is also a medium in its own right. There's going to be really distinct aesthetic differences between a relief print, an intaglio print, litho, stencil, screen printing, and then all of their subcategories. They're all very unique, and they all have individual aesthetic properties. Conceptually, printmaking, again dealing with the concept of multiples, there's also a long, rich tradition and history with the techniques of making a print. And while some printmakers seek to continue that tradition, others want to challenge it, like the concept of a monoprint. It kind of goes against everything you think a print is supposed to be. And some contemporary artists are playing with this idea that you can take a process that's supposed to be very methodical and repeatable and make it very spontaneous, or even in some cases unpredictable. As I mentioned previously in the lecture, printmakers are often limited to the resources that they have available to them, and that actually limits what kinds of prints they're able to make. So if you don't have a press, you can probably make a woodcut or a lino cut on your own. However, making a lithograph without a shop would be pretty difficult. You have to manage the chemicals and find a way to apply the correct amount of pressure. In addition, however big your press is basically the limit to the size of your print. So if you have a tabletop printing press, you're not going to be printing a 6-foot long woodcut. Which brings me to yet another example of contemporary printmaking and the sense of community that printmakers uphold. Some programs and shops actually host steamroll printing events, like we see in this photo, in which they rent a steamroller and they invite members of the community to participate in the process. And while this is just a fun shared experience, it also enables people who would previously not have been able to create really big woodcuts. The whole event is really a great bonding experience of being able to ink up really big blocks and watch people's prints come to life on paper, while also giving printmakers the chance to meet other people working in the same medium as them. And while there is more of a print shop collective vibe to printmaking, art itself is such a communal event. When we look at auction houses and museums and institutions, sometimes we overlook the humanity of the work. Yeah, the work should stand on its own, but as we're studying these different processes and what it means to make, there is so much more to art than just selling it and the final product. I mean, giving a brief insight to my own creative process, before I even start a piece, I think about how it applies to my research. I brainstorm with my family and my significant other. I talk to my peers. There's so much conceptual and cultural exchange with just the prep work for the idea itself, not even the work. And then when you're in a studio with other people who are also really passionate about what they're doing and making things in a medium that they love, there's just so much energy and support in that kind of environment that I honestly think is unique to the arts. And that is the conclusion of my lecture. Please stay safe, make sure you get some sleep, and I will see you all in class.